Hello everyone, and welcome to our webinar on making sense of your electricity use. My name is Gerry Flores and I am the manager of the New South Wales Farmers Energy Innovation Program. The Energy Innovation Program is being delivered with help and funding from the federal government's Energy Efficiency Information Grants Program, or EEIG, and its purpose is to help agribusinesses across the state better manage their energy costs by providing them with information about energy efficiency and renewable energy technologies. Our webinar today is about understanding your electricity use and will be presented by Bill McGhie. Bill McGhie is Director of Organization Capacity Building and Training at Carbon Training International. He leads the training team which has developed Australia's first competency-based carbon management training courses and has trained workers and consulted in a wide range of industries including agriculture. He is an expert in environmental and OH&S management and is also a member of the Australian Life Cycle Assessment Society. He spent 9 years working on sustainable agriculture research trials, focusing on the impact of farming practices on soil carbon. He's also an accomplished academic. Bill has a master's degree in OH&S and environmental management from the University of Western Sydney, a master's degree in science from the University of Sydney, graduate diplomas in environmental management and education, a diploma of applied science in agriculture, and a certificate in workplace training and assessment. He will be presenting today and available to answer your questions on today's topic of understanding your electricity use. Before I hand over to Bill, I also want to explain how today's webinar will work. Don't yell at your microphone if you have a question. All attendees are muted. If you want to ask a question, please enter it into the questions box of the GoToWebinar panel. It should be there on the bottom right. You can also type it into the chat box. I will help moderate these questions and we will try to address all of them at the end of the presentation. All right, excellent. So without further ado, I'll hand this over to Bill McGhie.
Yes, good morning everyone. I'd like to take the opportunity today to thank you for attending and hope that we can clarify any confusion that you may have about your energy bills. I put the statement on the first slide there that says energy is the least accountable business input. Most of us really have no good understanding of where energy is going within our organisations, and hopefully today we'll be able to give you some clarity about what's happening there and answer your questions, and that's the key part. We're trying to keep the presentation down to a minimum and hopefully prompt and promote some questions, but really the value for you will be being able to get your questions aired and get a good answer to them. So hopefully we'll give you some value out of this. One of the key things to understand about energy is who's got their hand in your pocket, like what's involved in the supply chain and what are these different players in the market trying to do. So of course we start off with the actual generators. In Australia we've got a mix of renewable, coal-fired, gas, hydro that's either very old or very new depending on the emphasis in that region. So Tasmania, for instance, has had hydro for quite some time. You've got the Snowy Mountains scheme in New South Wales, and then we've got quite new renewables with all the solar rooftops and the wind farms on a larger scale, and just the beginnings of a large-scale solar industry. You've probably heard about the renewable energy target in the news recently, and to encourage renewable energy production, there's a fee that has to be paid by the retailers, given based on a percentage of the energy they sell. And currently that percentage sits at around 11 or 12%, and that's reviewed regularly. And just keep that in mind when we come to the breakdown of the energy bills, and that renewable energy target is clearly shown on what we call unbundled bills. The energy generation market's quite interesting in itself. It's very competitive. It's on basically a 5-minute bidding basis where generators bid in to provide power on the forecast demand over the coming hours onto the national electricity network. So when they bid in, they say, well, we'll generate at this price, and they are either called on to produce that demand or told to stand down by the organisation that administers that market. So it's very much a minute-by-minute situation there, and it's very competitive, and it responds to different things very quickly. So, for instance, with the recent introduction of liquefying natural gas and exporting it, a number of the natural gas-powered generators have actually shut down and sold their energy contracts to those exporters. So they've sold their gas supply contracts to the energy exporters, and that gas is being sent overseas instead of being burnt to make electricity. So that shifts the market substantially, creates more opportunity for coal-fired power generation to step in, which is exactly what's happened over the last 8 months or so, and is one of the reasons that Australia's emissions from generating electricity have gone up over the last 8 months or so. So once the electricity is generated, it's transported over long distances by an organisation called Transgrid, and these are the large stanchions you see marching across the countryside, and electricity is typically carried across those at around 330,000 volts, so very high voltages to try and minimise the losses across those distances. And then it goes into the distribution networks, and if you're in New South Wales, you'll have heard about the privatisation of the poles and wires. This is the area that we're talking about here. So it's that network distribution, where it takes the high voltage electricity from the national transmission and basically reduces it to usable voltages for your homes and properties. So and for most rural people, you're dealing with essential energy in that case. And then you've got the retailer who basically coordinates that. And all the retailer's doing in this production line really is administering the purchase of the electricity from the generator and the sale of it to the individual homes and businesses. So the networks and the transmission networks charge the retailer, and the generator charges the retailer, and they charge you. So it's an important sort of thing to comprehend as to what's going on there, and the sorts of things that are faced. And when we look at the network constraints, the prices that are charged to the retailers for that electricity are based on an average and based on forward contracts in general. And what happens in a lot of cases is that they get caught short, they haven't bought enough in that forward market, and they have to then go onto the spot market. And I'll come back to that point and just talk about some of the prices when we get to the end, and we say, well, what can you do to negotiate a better bill, and what makes a more attractive customer for an energy retailer?
Sorry, Bill, before we move on,
Yep.
Can I address on obviously something that's very real for everyone out there is the electricity price rises that we've seen recently. So out of those components that you showed us, where have the rises come from? Where in our electricity price is each component, and how much have they changed recently?
Okay, so that's an interesting point, and I've actually I've got another slide that I will just quickly flick to just to answer that question. Just bear with me for 1 second while I bring that up, because it is an interesting point, and there's a lot of assumptions made at the moment about what's driving energy prices and what's actually happening in the market. versus the reality of what's happening in the market, and this slide demonstrates that quite nicely. So just slight change in presentation here.
Okay.
I'll just get to the correct slide, but it's basically what we're looking at is an example from an organisation I've been doing some work for recently, and this is the average cost per kilowatt hour. Now this is quite a big user. These people are purchasing about 8 megawatt hours a month, so a reasonable sized user. But you can see there from July 13 through to June 2014, their average cost of electricity actually went down, and down quite substantially. Now, in that case, it was the end of one contract and the start of another. This is all pre-carbon price, that there would have been a, oh sorry, this is during the carbon price. So what we're looking at here is the impact of changing contracts. And you can see over that period, no really substantial rise. Now, of those 16 or 13 cents that's being charged there, the breakdown is usually of that, you're looking at about 5 to 6 cents per kilowatt hour if you're averaging the peak and off-peak, being the energy component. So if you're looking at the 13 cents, 5 or 6 cents of that for energy, another 7 or 8 cents for the network costs, and then the remainder split up between the other sorts of fees and charges. So the market itself over the last couple of years has become much more competitive. Most of us are used to seeing graphs that look something more like this, where you've got the the steep increases and whatnot that did occur, and this is from 1981 through to 2011, so 30 years of increases where they've increased 250% for household and small business. But really what's happened since is very much a levelling off, and into the future with the changes in the rules, there's really no reason to expect any rapid increases over the next few years. And what I've been told recently, because one of my colleagues is an energy broker, is that the word on the market is that the expectation is the rise in energy costs will be about 1% a month. And what we're talking about there is what types of prices are people getting when they sign up to 2-year contracts, and that 2-year price will increase steadily as time goes by. It's quite an interesting field in that there's so many influences that come into play. For instance, I mentioned the displacement of natural gas from electricity generation and being repurposed or resold to the LNG exporters. Now, that opportunity is probably a 2 or 3 opportunity, and globally that's heavily impacted, for example, by the Americans widening the Panama Canal so they can export their shipments of liquefied natural gas into a market that we've got a bit of a stranglehold on at the moment. So being able to get those larger ships through the Panama Canal will put downward pressure on the price of the LNG exports. Russia doing deals with China and South Korea on supply of natural gas will also put downward pressure, and so in New South Wales we've been led into a manufactured gas crisis, and the incumbents who are trying to start coal seam gas mining and extraction and those sorts of operations are really trying to pull the wool over the consumer's eyes by focusing on the very short term, And yes, there'll be a short-term increase or a hump in gas prices, but by 2018 and late 2017, when all these other competitive markets start eating into our export markets, that local price will be pushed down. And even recently, the unforeseen halving of the crude oil price has depressed that somewhat as well. So, you know, right back at the power generation stage, there's very, you know, it's a very interesting area. The other thing to keep in mind with that is that with the competition from renewables now, the wholesale price that the fossil fuel power generators can command has actually decreased. So if you look at what they were getting back in 2010 per kilowatt hour, they were able to charge 8 to 10 cents and in a lot of cases 14 cents per kilowatt hour as an average price. In a lot of cases now that's dropped and they're happy to get between 3 and 8 cents depending on the time of day. So a lot of the coal-fired power stations are producing electricity at 3 cents kilowatt hour, and you know that's less than they were getting at the start of this decade. So it's the majority has come from what they've called the gold plating of the networks. And just to quickly explain that, the distribution networks had a perverse incentive to invest in capital in that they could borrow, say, $100 million at government bond rates, which is, you know, 5 or say %, and they could invest that in their infrastructure. And then the way the rules were set up, they can charge the interest on that capital at the full commercial rate. So what they were doing is borrowing it at sort of 5 and 6% and then charging it back to the consumers at 11 and 12%. So they're actually making money from borrowing money, which encouraged them to make investments that really didn't need to be made. And the Australian Energy Market Operator has only just clamped down on them, and you'll have heard cries of foul play from the networks in recent months about this, and they're saying, oh, it's going to affect safety and it's going to affect reliability. Basically what it will do is drive those network prices down. So, yeah, people predicting the future of energy prices, to me, are having themselves on. You know, could go up, could go down. It's such a volatile thing, and it has so many variables that accurate predictions are virtually impossible in this field. So, you know, from what I hear and just looking at the overall picture, we should be seeing fairly stable energy prices probably for the, you know, remainder of this decade at least. That will really, you know, increase its CPI and be minor increases, but not those, you know, 30% in a year sorts of things that some people were predicting and have happened in previous years, where big jumps occurred in quite short periods. So hopefully some energy stability creeping into the market. And that's without even considering the further impact that things like solar storage, so having batteries become available and economic to use. So just to recap on that, we've got the generators, we've got the network operators, then we move on to the meter providers. We have to, so in a lot of cases now that the meters aren't owned by the networks, they're owned by another organisation. Meter reading can be an additional charge because that might be outsourced as well. We have to pay for the regulators, and then we pay for different federal schemes and state schemes. And also the retailer, of course, has to get their hit out of it. And if you've signed up through an energy broker, they'll be getting their cut out of it as well. So you can see that, you know, it's a reasonably long supply chain. There's a lot of people involved. Overall, it's a pretty efficient process, and there is plenty of room to have choices within that market. So when you're looking at your energy bill, there's two types of bill. There's what we call bundled bills and unbundled bills. Now the bundled bills are your typical household bill that really doesn't have much detail on it. It will show you the details of the organisation. So it'll show you the property details. When we talk about NMIs or NIMIs, we're talking about the National Meter Identifier, and this is a unique number that every electricity meter in the country has. So, you know, there's no two numbers the same whether you're in Queensland or Tasmania or Perth. Each meter on the national market has its unique identifier. It will show you the energy used and how much they're charging you for that, and the daily excess charge. So if you have a smart meter, it might show you time of use, or if you have a peak and controlled load or off-peak meter, you might have that breakdown as well. And some of you may have the solar rebate, or basically being paid for your solar that you're exporting. So really it's those basic numbers. They come along, they read your meter. You've used 5,000 kilowatt hours this month. We're going to charge you 38 cents for each one of those. Plus we're going to charge you 80 cents a day just for being connected to the network. And then they'll basically tally that up, less any solar that you've exported. So the bundled bill doesn't really have much information and doesn't really provide a lot of useful information. Probably the most useful thing on a bundle bill is where it shows you your historical consumption, and you can just monitor that to compare, you know, the previous quarter to the quarter that at the same time last year, and if it's increased, can you explain that particular increase? So it's important to monitor your bills, and if there is any sudden changes, I would suggest that if you can't explain them, get onto that early, because the retailers can be reluctant to address those things, and if you go for 4 or 5 bills and it's consistently higher, you can have trouble getting that money back. And no, there's cases where people are basically tampering with distribution boards and those sorts of things, and stealing other people's electricity, or even meters that go faulty and start reading double of what they should be. So keep an eye on it. Certainly as soon as you see something that's unexpected, get onto your retailer. Now, unbundled bills show you a lot more detail, and instead of talking to it, I'll actually just show you one that has more detail for each of the sections that we mentioned before. So energy charges, you can see here it's got the peak rate, the off-peak rate, and the shoulder rate. Now, it gives you the quantity, how many kilowatt hours were consumed, the rate, and the amount. Now this one is written in a fairly straightforward way. Some of them are quite confusing, in that if you try and total the kilowatt hours here, that add up with the kilowatt hours for network, and that comes down to the different ways they apply the distribution loss factors to the different elements of the bill. Now what I'm talking about with a distribution loss factor and a network loss factor is that depending on where you are in the network, the energy that's delivered to you can be delivered either very efficiently with minimal losses in the poles and wires, or if you're at the end of a very long very long branch from a local transformer, you might find that 2.5 or 3% of your energy is being lost in that long branch line. And what they do is they multiply your reading by 1.03 to basically charge you for the energy they've lost getting it to you. So those things are sometimes shown on unbundled bills. In bundle bills, they're never shown. It's all just incorporated into that number of kilowatt hours. So you can see here in this bill, peak, off-peak and shoulder, and they always seem to write it in that order, even though it doesn't really make sense to do so. You can see in this case peak and off-peak, and this is a bill from a business in Orange, so it's not a Sydney bill. It's relevant to regional business. You can see the peak and shoulder in this case are actually the same number for energy, so there's no difference for the time of use there. But the off-peak is a fair bit cheaper, so 3.8 cents per kilowatt hour for off-peak versus closer to 5.8 for peak and shoulder. So the word in the market is that a lot of the generators are actually trying to gouge the off-peak market a little bit, because that's the time of day where solar can't compete at all, and you know you haven't got all the wind all the time. So the 3.8 cents there has actually increased proportionally, whereas the 5.8 has come down. So it's interesting that the generators are trying different strategies to claw back a bit of income there. So we get our total then, and the total's actually missing from that. It should be a sum of $8,000 there. We then have the network charges. So you can see here we've got the off-peak kilowatt hours, and the network charges you 2.89 cents for carrying each kilowatt hour to you during that during the off-peak time, and at peak and shoulder they charge you 4.8 cents per kilowatt hour to do that. Now, the other thing that they do is they charge you what's called a demand charge on top of that. And what this represents is the peak energy use that you've put on, or peak energy demand that you've put on the network during that, and in this case, 31-day period. So you can see up the top here, this is a monthly bill, so for 31 days. And you can see this kVA figure. So the peak during the month in the shoulder was 424 kVA, and for each of those they charged $14.23, and off-peak was for 412, and for each of those they've charged $3.25. Now, for those of you who are on this type of tariff and doing something like irrigating, there's quite substantial savings to be made. Not so much, well certainly there's a saving to be made from using or pumping during off-peak times, in that you're paying 2 cents a kilowatt hour less straight up, and in the network charges you're also paying close to 2 cents a kilowatt hour less. But the big benefit is that the kVA charge would drop. Say if we had, say, a 400 kilowatt pump, or 4 100 kilowatt pumps that we're running, then the monthly charge for the demand, if we could keep all our pumping in off-peak periods, would be $1,340 a month instead of this combined. So if we pumped whenever we felt like it, we would be charged close to $11,000 a month, or just on $11,000 a month. So one of the things that you can do or get out of your energy bill is to actually figure out, is it worth my while to get up in the middle of the night to schedule pumping or to invest in timers and a bit of automation to save in this case, you know, $11,000 a month in demand charges, plus another probably $2,000 or $3,000 in energy and network charges. But you can see out of these network components, you know, for transporting the energy, we're charged basically about $8,000 for that. For demanding a certain level of energy supply from the network, we're actually charged over $12,000. So, you know, that's where for a lot of organisations the network component of the bill is very large. It's, you know, it's accounting for 60. The highest I've seen is about 80% of the bill for network charges. The lowest is hardly ever below 50%. So then we move into the other, where we've got the energy saving certificate charge, so that's the state-based scheme. We've also got the charge for the large-scale renewable energy certificates, the Australian Energy Market Operator charge, their ancillary charge, the small-scale renewable energy charge, and the reason there's a large-scale and a small-scale energy charge is that when the solar rooftop schemes were being heavily promoted, there was a genius who said we should give what we call deemed renewable energy certificates to solar systems to increase the uptake of those things. They were told by a number of industry experts that would break the market, which it did. So then they had to split the market into large scale and small scale. So when you put solar panels on your roof and it's a system less than 10 kilowatts, sorry, 100 kilowatts, you're into the small scale renewable energy scheme. If your renewable energy project is over 100 kilowatts in capacity, you move into this large scale renewable energy scheme. And that allowed the wind farms and large-scale solar to operate in a different market and protected them from the wild fluctuations that were occurring due to oversupply. The service charge, meter provider, data agent charges, the Encompass Light charge there is a monitoring charge, and a supplementary metering charge, which who knows in this case what that one's for. So you can see that there is quite an array of different charges on that bill, and that you know, there's a lot of information there that you can use and that you must take into account when you're making decisions about energy use and how to minimise your energy costs. One of the benefits of having access to the unbundled bills is that what also happens with that is you get access to what we call interval data, and that can be used to give you a much more accurate picture of your energy consumption over time. So this is quite coarse. This is only 1 day at a time, whereas what's available from the networks, you can actually contact them and say, I want my interval data. And in most cases, they can provide you with half-hourly interval data. So what did you consume during a half-hour period for an entire year? And that detail they will send to you in a spreadsheet. Some can only do it down to daily, and others can do it to quarter of an hour. So it's really something that depends on the retailer and what they're willing to do for you and what you sign up to in a contract. So one of the things to keep in mind is time of use. So when we look at time of use, we need to think about what's essential to use in different times, can we shift our demand to different times, and if we're going to invest in solar, for instance, that the patterns of usage have implications for solar and how big a solar system we purchase, and to understand the different cost structures. So down the bottom there, once again from Orange, a smaller consumer, where the peak, shoulder and off-peak rates actually have quite different charges in this case, and it then becomes viable to look at the implications of not consuming power in those peak periods. Should we be looking to shift some of our load to shoulder? Do we do simple things if it's a business in the city where we're maintaining offices? Is there a way that we can reduce the air conditioning demand, for instance, during those hours of the day that are peak, so that we only consume the smallest amount possible during those times? And is there other things that we can shift to off-peak so we can use that energy that's, in this case, 30% of the price of the peak? So really, this is other valuable information, and this you can get from a bundle bill as well. Your bundle bill, where you have a time of use meter, will show you those three rates. Sometimes, perversely, the shoulder period is more expensive than the peak, and really any things like that are a reflection of where you sit in the network, and can reflect very localised network constraints. So there's areas of the electricity network that are struggling to provide the level of demand that's required, and the networks actually do business cases to say, well, is it cheaper for us to pay people not to demand electricity? And they'll generally approach larger businesses and say, well, can you switch off in these periods and we'll compensate you for that? Or is it better for them to just invest in more poles and wires and increase the supply to that area? So that's the sort of thing that that is used to make those decisions. What can you do when you're looking at your energy bills and trying to assess how you can save money? Certainly, and those of you who watched the ABC show where they talked about being a good consumer, they talked about the lazy tax. Most people haven't really run their retailer and said, look, I'm not happy with the discount I'm getting, I can get a better discount elsewhere. So to give you an idea, currently, and I need to update this because I managed to squeeze another few percent out of them. Currently on my electricity and gas, I get 21 and 16% discounts respectively, so 21% on my electricity bill and 16% off the gas bill. I met someone the other day, and I've got to chase this up now. She claims she's getting a 27% discount. So if you look at your energy bill and you're getting a grand total of 10%, you really need to get onto them and chase them. And having a vested interest, of course, I make it my business to really give them a hard time and try and extract the maximum discount. And I've managed to get it up to 25% for electricity. But the thing is, you've got to make sure you're comparing apples with apples. So if you are offered a new deal, you've got to be very clear on what the discount is offered on, whether it's on the whole bill, whether it's on just the energy usage, which bits of the bill are included for that discount and which are not. So if you're talking to someone on the phone, I would suggest that set up a spreadsheet on your computer screen so you can type in the numbers and see exactly how that would compare to your existing situation. And one other lesson that I've learned is that once they offer you that discount and you get your next bill, check that discount's applied properly. I had a quite a long argument with Energy Australia saying that 21% of $300 was not $28, and surprisingly that fact took a long while to get across, and then the penny dropped that, well, actually they had made a mistake, and it took them a long time to accept that. So don't trust their billing systems. The retailers have just been through quite a large amalgamation process. So you've got things like True Energy have been taken up by Energy Australia, and they're trying to mix different accounting systems, and there's lots of mistakes that creep into it. So if you're being offered a discount at the moment, I'd be looking at that and calculating it yourself and making sure that it's being applied properly, because it has taken me about 6 months to get the correct bill from Energy Australia, and I'm not unique in that case. So there's a number of things you can do. Compare your energy rate to those around you. Ask the people around you what they're paying, and if you're getting a good discount, let your neighbours know so they can share in that. The government has a website called Energy Made Easy that allows you to compare some of the retailers that offer in your area. So you can set up that, and it doesn't do a bad job of sort of offering that comparative price, and it takes into account, you enter whether you've got solar production or not as well, so it takes that into account in choosing the appropriate retailer. So I'll leave it there. I'm happy to talk about other issues as well, but if people have questions, hopefully we've received some during the presentation.
Yep.
And what I'll do now is just get Gerry to coordinate that.
Yep. All right. Thanks very much, Bill. Thank you for all that information. It was very encompassing. We have received a few questions. I also wanted to comment that that website is very good. Energy Made Easy, to compare electricity suppliers, as you said. And more so, there's been some changes now in New South Wales, for example, that we have the new retailer Power Shop come in. So it's good to have a look in there and see if it's any more competitive than your current offer. But on to our questions. We have one here on what are the typical hours for off-peak, peak and shoulder, and do they include weekends?
Okay, so it's always worth checking how you're being charged. So typically peak hours are 7 o'clock till 9 o'clock and 5 o'clock till, 7 a.m. to 9 a.m. and 5 p.m. to 8 p.m. They're typically the peak hours. Now shoulder is then between 9 o'clock and 5 o'clock, and then from 8 p.m. to 10 p.m. Typically there's no peak and shoulder charged on weekends. So if you look at those hours, and there's 168 hours in a week, there's 93 hours of off-peak. So basically if you have a task, whether it's pumping, whether it's running equipment, whatever it is that takes less than 93 hours in a week, you can schedule that entire operation to occur in off-peak hours. So understanding that from basically 10 p.m. on a Friday night through to 7 a.m. on a Monday morning is off-peak is crucial. Now the exception to that, of course, is if you've got one of the old spinning meters and you're basically charged for peak whenever you're using energy through that spinning meter. So it's only the smart meters that record time of use that you'll get that long weekend benefit of off-peak. So generally with that you have a second meter if you've got off-peak hot water or those sorts of things. So your off-peak hot water only comes on at certain times of the day, and that's controlled by the network itself.
Okay.
So if you've got a time of use meter, you can take advantage of those times of use.
All right. On that point you made about the meters, we have another question by another attendee here who is asking, I have a time of use meter installed. To get it in use, do I need to contact my provider or retailer to swap over? He's done the research and it's cheaper for him to control his electricity usage. And he also has a controlled load meter. Does he need to change this one over to time of use as well?
So with the controlled load meter, that would typically be running your hot water service. And in that case, what you need to do is, if you're going to go to time of use, the hot water service will then come on whenever it feels like it. So if it drops below the thermostat temperature at any time of day, it will come on, which can really bump up your energy bills. The thing to do is, if you've calculated that you can shift your demand to those off-peak times and that you will save money, well and good, and yes, you do have to contact your retailer and ask for a tariff review and say, look, I want to move to a different tariff structure. So, you know, taking advantage of that, but be careful to look at your time of use charges. I know in some areas of Sydney, the peak hours for residential, there's people paying 55 cents a kilowatt hour during those times. Interestingly, when I look at bills in the regions, I don't see those charges, and peak and shoulder being charged both at something around 38 cents is more common. So the peak and shoulder differential can be important to look at. If you've got a good understanding of what your energy demand is, where it's going, and which bits of it you can control, yes, you can benefit from moving to time of use. In reality, only about 40% of people will benefit from moving to time of use. But the important thing is to then install a timer for your hot water service so it only operates on that off-peak time. And you can basically put a 7-day timer in so that it will operate all weekend, you know, if you think that's necessary. So those are the sorts of things to keep in mind with that.
Okay, thanks very much, Bill. The attendee who asked that question has also answered that he appreciates your response and that it was very informative. A question that I have, for example, is we've seen some people that get additional charges, other types of charges. One of them, for example, is a demand charge, and they tell us that power factor is important in demand charges. Can you explain a bit about that?
Yeah, so I'll just flick back to that relevant slide with the time of use. So the demand charge refers to this kVA, and the kVA is a different way of putting kilowatts. So if I've got a 100 kilowatt electric motor, then the kilowatt reading, if I run that for 1 hour, that 100 kilowatt motor will use 100 kilowatt hours. Now, because electric motors use magnetic fields and induction to basically cause that electromotive force, some of the energy that's supplied to that motor is lost. So what you can find is that a 100 kilowatt motor should ideally put a demand on the network of 100 kVA. Now that is very rarely the case, and in a lot of cases that might be as high as 120 kVA. So to look at this example on this bill, if I've got an inefficient electric motor that's pulling 120 kVA to operate, that's going to cost me an extra 20 kVA charges for that particular period. So we can see that for this bill here, it's $14 a kVA. So for every month, it's going to cost me $280 extra because of that inefficient motor. And that pretty quickly starts to make a business case for doing something about power factor correction. So to look at it a different way, when we look at power factor, it can be compared in a number of ways, where, you know, the beer analogy goes down well with some people. It has its faults, but if we're using power efficiently, we're getting the ideal amount of head on our beer. If we're pouring our beer inefficiently or using our energy inefficiently with what the network supplies to us, we're not getting a very satisfying beer there. Now, the satisfaction to us isn't what's important, it's the satisfaction to the network in this case. And if we're wasting the energy that they're providing to us, they charge us more for it. So power factor correction actually says to that 100 kilowatt motor, okay, here's what you're doing to the network, I'm going to correct that and actually make sure that the 100 kilowatt power demand from the motor is recognised by the network as a 100 kVA load. And in that case, it would save us that $280 a month in doing that. So there's some strong physics involved here, where there's a relationship between real power, apparent power, and reactive power. But basically, this reactive component is the magnetic forces pushing back and pushing the current out of phase with the voltage. So I don't want to go too much into that. Another way of looking at it is if you think of pulling a load, the most efficient way to pull a load is straight in front. This is meant to represent the old towpaths on the canals in Europe and the UK and places like that. If you're pulling a load at an angle, you lose some of the pulling force because of the vectors involved. So that's a similar sort of way to think about power factor. But if you've got a power factor of 0.8 and even really now below 0.9, it's power factor correction, which is an installation that occurs at your meter, has a payback typically of 18 months or less in most cases. So it's where you've got a poor power factor, and it can be well worth addressing that. And the typical things you're looking for is if you've got lots of motors, electric motors, or you've got large banks of fluorescent lighting and things like that, will give you typically a poor power factor.
Okay, thanks very much, Bill. We have another question which I think you might need to flick back to the bill to have a look. This question is, what is DLF and MLF equals total loss? So I'm not sure where this was seen. It's
so if you look at the top of the bill here, we've got the distribution loss factor, which is the DLF, and the MLF, the marginal loss factor. And these two things are basically what the network has lost getting the energy to you. And that was the multiplier I was talking about, where these units, the quantity that's charged for, isn't the quantity that lines up with the meter reading. So often in here they'll have meter reading 1, meter reading 2, the result here, and then they'll actually show the multiplication of these kilowatt hour numbers by these loss factors. So in this case they'd be inflated by another 13% or so. And so that charge is passed on to you as a consumer, basically depending on where you are in the network. These are quite high. typically they'd be 1 and 2%, not 9 and 4%. So that's quite a high one. So really that's a reflection of where you are on that network. You can see here, a little bit of extra information on the demand. 424.4 was the peak recorded for that actual month, and it tells you the date and the actual time. So if you go back through your last 12 months of bills, and it always happens to be on a Tuesday at 1 o'clock, you can go and ask, well, what happens on a Tuesday at 1 o'clock, or what happens every day at 1 o'clock that's causing this consistency? And you'd be surprised in most businesses how consistent that is.
Okay. And sorry, is the distribution versus a marginal loss factor, is there a difference between them in what they relate to?
It's where it occurs, so in which parts of the network.
Okay. Yep. All right. A question from me regarding what you can ask a retailer. Is it possible for a customer to ask for their bill to be unbundled?
When you look at an unbundled bill, that typically only applies to what we call contestable customers. So until you get to, in most cases, 100 megawatt hours a year, which is 100,000 kilowatt hours per year consumption, you won't be able to move into these contracts where you get the unbundled bills. And in between, there's all sorts of thresholds. So once you get above 60 megawatt hours or so, you can find that even in your bundled bill, you might start to get a demand charge. And the networks have quite an involved tariff structure to say what they're going to charge depending on the amount of electricity you use and how consistent you are with using it. So if you're an inconsistent user, you have very high demand at some stage and very low demand at other, you're better off staying generally on a bundled bill because you don't get a demand charge. So if you're really on the threshold of choosing to become a contestable customer or staying on a regulated tariff, you need to carefully assess how your demand works. But as I said, you have to be a larger customer, so unless your electricity bills are going north of $5,000 a month, you're probably not looking at being a contestable customer.
Okay.
So that's typically what you need to look at.
All right, so one last question before we start our wrap-up. We have a question here. Should a power company show if the reads are an estimate or a real read?
Yeah, that will be indicated on your bill. Typically there's an E in brackets next to the quantity. So up here where they've got the kilowatt hours, it will usually have a bracket and an E in there to indicate that it is an estimate.
And a question for me, does that apply to the new time of use meters?
Typically it wouldn't, unless they've had some sort of technical fault, where they weren't able to poll the meter and get the information back. So if they've had a technical fault or there's some reason they haven't been able to read it, then they can estimate as well. But you've got to remember that in balance, when an actual reading is taken, it all tallies up. So you might either get a bit bigger bill in the actual read or even a smaller bill if they've overestimated. If you think that the estimate's too high, you can actually ring them and discuss that with them and say, look, I need it estimated down, and that will reduce the bill that you're faced with. But bear in mind that if you underestimate, you'll have to pay extra next time.
Okay, great. Well, I think that about wraps up the presentation. Bill, thank you very much. But before we go, I'd just like to point out that we do have a few events that are coming up that might be of interest to the people listening to us. And Bill McGhie is actually providing some of the training in one of these events. We have an energy management basics training for the Orange small and medium enterprises business community in Orange. That's taking place on Wednesday, the 11th of March. So if anyone is interested to register for that event, I've put a URL there for you guys to follow, which is tinyurl.com/OEH Energy Training Orange. I believe the cost for this training seminar or workshop is $50, and Bill can tell you more about it. Bill?
Yeah, so it's over 2 3-hour sessions. The first session is Tuesday the 10th from 6 p.m. to 9 p.m. and then the following morning on the 11th from 8 a.m. to 11 a.m. So that people have less time away from their business. We've tried to run one of the sessions in the evening.
Great. Yeah, apologies. That's right. It's on the 10th of March and the 11th of March. So there's that URL there to register for that. And New South Wales Farmers will also be providing some training. This will be in the Sydney area. We will do a regional training session, but that hasn't been locked down just yet. But the Sydney area is welcome to attend a free energy training workshop in our offices. And the URL to attend that is right there as well, which is tinyurl.com, New South Wales Farmers Energy Workshop, and then just the number 1. This will take place on the 25th of March, and it's a 4-hour workshop from 9 a.m. to 1 p.m. Again, if there's any more questions or some questions that we didn't manage to get to at the moment, we do have your contact details from when you registered, so we'll try to address those by email. And finally, if there's any more questions in general about energy efficiency, renewables, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, we also have the New South Wales Farmers Energy Hotline, which I'll have to jot down because I don't have it in a slide, 0294781013, or you can reach me on my email, which is jerryf@newsouthwalesfarmers.org.au. So thank you very much, Bill. Thanks, everybody, as well, and we'll attend to any additional questions via email. Thank you.